Good evening, everybody. This is Matt Webster back with a video on my Christian Journey series. Today, I kind of want to go over some life events and stuff, and the path I've kind of chosen to go down for like the last few months and even just the last few years of my life. There's a lot that I can say about certain things, and what I'm wanting to get at with this video is how things relate to the current times and what I've come to understand and see of what's happening in the world, and maybe some truth of enlightenment, because I think there might be some things that aren't necessarily true that people might believe, and lies of the enemy, being Satan, and that tend to stem a lot further than people think, even amongst the church and Christians in general. So, one thing I'd mentioned in one of my earliest videos was that, one, I am completely aware that I am not without sin, and that I have done some pretty, by Jesus standards, not great things. Some of the biggest things I've done is slept with prostitutes and escorts. I visited strip clubs, and I have, in a way, objectified women. And I think a lot of that stems from a wound that maybe I didn't want to acknowledge, and that was that a lot of times growing up, I was felt made to feel unworthy to be around women. There was always bigger, stronger, more handsome men than myself, and it never felt like, no matter how much effort I put in, how much willingness I was to do things that other people wouldn't, I never felt like I was getting anywhere. And in some ways I wish I'd just stayed the path. There'd be a lot less pain involved, but I realized that there's some lessons that I've learned along the way that I wouldn't have otherwise. So whilst the sins weren't good themselves, the lessons that I've learned from them have become paramount to who I am and my understanding of people and things that are going on now in this world. Having said that, there's a story in the Bible that I feel like reflects really well my own experiences from both sides of the parties involved in this. And the story is from Hosea. For Christians that know this story pretty well, I think a lot of times it gets skipped over because people forget about it. But the story of Hosea, he's a prophet in Israel who God one day tells to, in the verse, he spoke to the Lord, the Lord spoke to Hosea, "Go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So the story is a really interesting love story. Hosea naturally does what the Lord asked him to do, and he goes and takes a wife who, today's modern standard, would be considered like an escort or a prostitute. Whoredom. I can get into that quite a bit, and I don't think I necessarily need to for most people who understand what this is about. But he goes on to have 3 children with Hosea, and she steadily becomes more anxious and goes back to her own lifestyle, abandoning her husband and her children. As time goes on, the men that she slept with, the children that she left, and the husband, everything kind of becomes broken, and Hosea is left with heartbreak. But one day God says to Hosea, "Go to your wife, go buy her back, because she's being sold in a slave auction." A good point with this story is that slavery is a form of bondage, as most people would know. And these industries where escorts, strippers, any kind of real sexual thing is a form of bondage. Um, and you start seeing it more with like the women particularly that are involved in it. You start understanding that a lot of it comes down to issues in the mind and hearts of these women. Now, the reason why I'm getting into this is that one of the things I have noticed with the women that I have talked to through this environment, and this might be true for women in general, but there's a lot of self-confidence issues, and this isn't exclusively a female problem, but it's more noticeable in the women in this industry than I think anywhere else. And kind of relates to this generation. A lot of people talk about a lot of broken men who really are trying really hard to find women, and they just don't want, because they say women play games and they play around, and men end up going to these environments to find love. At least some of them. I know from my experience that was one of my many reasons for going there. The thing is that to kind of give more what I'm getting at, one of the very first girls that I came across was a young lady in a strip club, and we had talked and talked, and I got to know a little bit about her life story. And if I'm being honest, a lot of people haven't really figured this out yet, even close friends. I genuinely fell in love with this woman, and I'd like to believe in some way she also fell in love back. And I think a lot of it came down to feelings of unworthiness and uncleanliness, I guess is another way of saying it. She even described herself at one time to me as being toxic, and I thought a lot about where I had been and how I had done things, and how I felt, how sometimes I feel even on a day-to-day basis. But kind of getting at the point of with this, there was a sense of unworthiness, and she genuinely felt like she was a terrible person, and she couldn't have that lifestyle she wanted, not just because she was afraid of it, because she didn't think she could have it. And I understand this to some degree, because there's days where I don't think that I have earned or deserve that lifestyle. There's just a lot in my own life that I can unpack that goes into that. Things that go back to childhood and all sorts of things in my own personal life. But having said that, she was one of the first. I haven't talked to her in a while, simply because there needed to be distance, and I knew there was nothing I could say that was going to change her mind to make her believe that she was truly worthy. And the thing was is that I realized I also needed to heal myself, needed to step away and realize that it wasn't anything that I was doing wrong, and it wasn't for a lack of effort, but it was the kind of love that only God could fix. And going back to the story of Jose and Gomer, the point and the moral of the story is unconditional love, because when Jose goes back to buy Gomer from the slave market, as God commanded, he welcomes her back into their house, and he's not angry with her. He just wants her to come home with him. He wants his wife back. He wants the mother of his children back in their home. And going with what I was saying before, women tend to struggle with this more, I think, in most ways than men, because there's a deeper level to it, and I think women tend to experience intimacy a little bit better in some regards, so there's a lot of disbelief and doubt in them, more than so than men. I think we handle it a little differently, process it differently than women do. Now, the second woman that I want to talk about is a girl who her life has also been kind of a mess, going from childhood to things that have happened to her, people she's trusted. Um, she did some work in the sex industry in a different kind of platform, which is dominatrix work. Uh, when I first met her, I wasn't in a good spot, and this was just months ago now, that I'd kind of gone back to doing some not so great things in my life. And I'd met this girl, and honestly was looking to fill a void that couldn't be filled with what I wanted to. And we were sitting there, and like she talked about how she didn't believe in God because she had died at one point and came back. And when she died, there was just a white void. There was nothing there, it was just emptiness. Which I think, given the circumstances of what happened in her life, she might not see that the way I'm seeing it, which is understandable. Someone had one time mentioned to me that they thought there was a spot in between where we go to heaven and when we die, which isn't like condemnation in that, but it's more of a cleansing point for stepping off when we do die. I think what she saw was probably her being surrounded by the purity of God's love, and she probably doesn't realize it. And it's very interesting to me because one thing I noticed with her when talking, and she was talking about how I understood her hobbies and stuff like that, and how I supported it and wasn't judgmental, things like that, which wasn't the dominatrix work, just to clarify. But she had said something that was really interesting to me, and that was that I treated her like a princess. And it kind of dawned on me, I don't think maybe she's ever gotten that before. And I think God, when you have God in your life and you're reflecting what kind of love God has for his people, you naturally do things that other people won't do. You have a giving, unselfish heart, and you do things for other people because you want to see them genuinely happy and smile. And I've always been the kind of person that'll give until my hands bleed dry, so to speak. And I think in a way that's, sometimes it's not the best thing, because it's not always what God's asking you to do, but to have a generous, giving heart, to see others smile, that is definitely 100% in the realm of what God does and wants. And the reason why I'm saying this particularly isn't to boast or brag, it's simply to point out that sometimes when we're doing things for other people, we can start to realize the real nature of how God's love really works. A lot happens in people's lives where decisions are made, bad things happen. And one thing I've noticed in particular, and the reason why I bring up the fact that I feel like a lot of churches skip the story of Hosea, or they tend to read it very differently than what I'm trying to get at here, is that yes, these women are in sin, and I myself am in sin, but none of us are truly without sin. And whilst they're in this industry, a lot of it is they feel unworthy, unloved, unwanted. And modern society, whilst a lot of things have been done wrong over the years, we've got this wrong idea of how to treat each other, and there's a lot of idolization that I've noticed, and it stems from the top down, where the control comes from. And by top, I don't mean the godly top, which would be Jesus, God, people of godly nature. I'm talking about political, which to me tends to represent the enemy more than anything, which is Satan. If I'm being honest with most people, on a later video I'll get into this more, but I don't believe our political system or any political system in the world, being that it's man-made and probably comes from the whispers and lies of the enemy, but I think that both of our political parties, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, are actually not of God. And people can argue with me if they want to, I can accept that. I'm open to conversation, but I don't think that those things are of godly nature. And I know it says to follow governing bodies and things like that, but I still believe that ultimately, at the end of the day, the real power comes from God, and His authority is the only authority. Now, there's one more woman I want to talk about, and there's a girl who works in the escort industry, and we're sitting there listening to her talk one night. We're sitting there having dinner, and we're having this conversation, and I was talking about being godly and having the cross, and I'm not someone's gonna judge you, because obviously, look what I do. And the conversation had started about me wanting to run for mayor, and she'd ask if really hanging out with people like herself and people in the industry, wouldn't it be a hindrance? And my answer is no. And my reason for that is that if you read the Bible, if you're really truly reading it, Jesus didn't hang out with righteous people, at least not righteous in the sense of holy and always doing what appears to be godly and whatnot. Jesus didn't even come back for those people. He came back for the people in sin. People like in the escort industry, the stripping industry, dominatrix industry, sex industry in general, robbers, thieves. Those were the kind of people that Jesus came back to save and redeem. So I asked myself this question a while back, and I kept wondering why it was I felt something more for these people. And part of it comes down to something I'd realized through this conversation with a young lady out at dinner. When she was talking about it, and she had asked after I brought up the having this on, which is just my cross, I brought up being religious and wanting to run for mayor, and she'd brought that up, and then she'd asked the question, what does that say about me? And I looked at her, and I think maybe she was truly confused. I don't think she's ever heard of this before, but I told her, well, I don't judge you for what you're doing, and honestly, I kind of understand it. And I'm not trying to give people excuses or outs to what they're doing. I simply, like Jesus tries to do, meet people where they're at. And I don't think this generation's lost in the way that people think. I think that we have a bad system in place. I think that the system, especially the political system, has fed us a lot of lies. And I think the people in charge are not the people that should be in charge. I also don't think that we're going to fix the problem all the time by just talking about it. I do think that the people need to take back control and try to fix the problem. And having said that, going back into this industry and why I think this is important, I don't think we should demonize people in general, walk of life, things like that. However, I will say that I can't blame them when people can't afford to buy groceries, people can't afford housing, people can't afford the basics. And it used to be that people would go out and build their own houses and maintain their own food source, whatnot. I do think that we as people, when we moved away from that and tried to do what we're doing like here in America, we gave a lot of control to the enemy. And why I'm bringing this up is the people in charge are in control of all of that. And if you think they're not, I think you're probably insane and need to take a better look at what's going on around you and in the world. And not to demonize these people, but when you start chasing money, power, and control, you're chasing after the enemy. And I don't want $1 million. I don't want great power. I don't want control of things. what I want is freedom. And I don't think with this system any one of us can truly ever be free. I think in truth, the only way to really get to freedom is by understanding this book and what it really is. And the Bible is a love story from God to us. And a lot of people who read just the first couple of books, or they read a book here and there, aren't going to understand the full thing when they read completely through it. It took me reading through the entire Bible to really understand God's real nature, and I plan on reading through it multiple times in my lifetime. It shows a lot of compassion and a lot of opportunity, and there are so many times in this book that the Israelites, different people, had messed up and were given opportunity again and again and again. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is actually a story of Samson. Samson was someone who went after a woman that he should not have gone after. But he was redeemed at the very end of his life because he still chose God. And he brought the house of his enemy down upon him in his final breaths. So he was given an opportunity to be redeemed by God at the very end by just accepting it and believing in God and knowing that God had still chosen him. Which gets me to the point of whatever, that death in this life is not really the end of it all. It's not the true death. True death is the death of the spirit. And that feeling of unworthiness is a lie against your spirit and God's true nature. Which brings me back to the story of Hosea, and that again, unconditional love is such a big thing. And for those of us who want to reflect that love, it's complicated. Because we're never going to do it quite as good as God. But God is giving us the opportunity to. And I really think that we need better people in charge to do and show what God's nature really is. And I think if we're going to fix things and make things right so that people don't end up in these industries and that we don't need these industries, and I'm not dumb. I know these industries are always going to exist. I'm not dumb enough to believe that we're going to ever end them completely. But I think to get more people away from it and live the kind of lifestyles that God intended, we need to remove the power source that is keeping those people in these industries. And if people really aren't seeing what I'm trying to say here, I'm going to use an example of recent history that kind of proves my point. Look at the Epstein files. It wasn't one side of the aisle or the other. It was both. It's a lot of people with power and money. I truly believe that in order to change this, we're going to need to put our differences aside and work together. And it's not a matter of working with someone that you think is your enemy, because you're really working with your allies, because it's not liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican. It's us versus the devil. And we can win. We surely can. And you don't necessarily need to be of God right away. By working with someone that you don't necessarily agree with shows an act of love. And if we can learn to love each other unconditionally towards this goal, we can fix a lot of these things. And again, I learned a lot from being around the women in this industry in particular, because one of the other things, to get on a final point with this, the young lady that I was having dinner with, as soon as I said that, I could tell she kind of retreated back. Like, this woman was absolutely gorgeous and stunning, but I don't think she really thought she was gorgeous or stunning. And there's a line in the Bible that I think we as God's people need to hear more. I myself needed to hear it. and that is from the Song of Solomon, Book 4, verse 7. You are altogether beautiful, my love, for there is no flaw in you. I want people to hear that and really understand what it means. I think it's time for those of us who've been too afraid to speak out and say things to take center stage. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying that you're not going to have fears and doubts. But if you don't do it for yourself, do it for those around you. Do it to be the part of the change that we need. This country desperately needs a change. This world needs a change. And I think it has to start with those of us who our eyes are opening up and we're getting to see the world for what it is. But what it could be is also something that we're seeing. I hope this message finds you all well, and I hope that a lot more people will start making content like this and speak up, even when it's hard. Anyways, I'll see you all next time.